So hi, we're live, and I am so privileged to be here tonight with all of you. Thank you for tuning in to Blue Wave Conversations. And let me turn this one down.
Mary, what page are we live on? I'm trying to get it to show.
We're actually live in the event. We're actually live in the event. So if you go to the event or you go on our page, we should be there. And I will get ready to post that up in another group in a minute. I just want to be able to pass it over to have you interview our guests for this evening. I wanted to take a moment to just thank all of our viewers who are watching, those who've supported us over the years, over the last, well, it'll be a year in August, actually, August, September-ish, when we started the group. And it'll be a year in October when we started our first broadcast. So thank you all for tuning in and for watching and for participating and for sharing with us. So with that, I wanted to just take a second also to introduce our panel here. We have Jamie Nedick, and we have Vanessa Maddox, and we have our special guest, which I'm going to allow Jamie to introduce to us this evening with his extensive background. And I just want to thank you in advance, Max, for having this, taking this time out of your schedule to be with us to talk about this important conversation. Thank you so much. Jamie, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Hey, everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to you, Max Sawicki. I'm saying your name correctly, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. It's important I get it right. Max Max is an economist and writer here in Virginia. He is retired from the U.S. Government Accountability Office as of 2017. The GAO is one of my favorite places to go when I need reports on things like workforce planning and the federal workforce. But they do so much more work than that. And what they do is so important to making sure that our government runs efficiently and effectively. Right now, he has also worked at the Economic Policy Institute here in Washington, D.C., and he is presently a senior research fellow at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. So I wanted to take a moment to thank you for being here with us today, because we are going to start having a hard conversation about critical race theory. What is this? Why is everyone afraid of this? I've been open that I think that this is what I would liken to the satanic panic of our time, because I think that there's no threat here, but somehow we've gotten people worked up into a lather. And I would argue strongly that from my perspective, this is just the wedge issue that is coming in now that abortion no longer is a single issue for people to vote on. And this, to me, I got my vote necklace back on this evening because I think this is all about midterms, but I could be wrong. And so let's start out. What really is critical race theory? Because I know that when I studied literature in college, we used it as an analytical tool. But what was it really now?
Well, let me just say first, I don't want to hold myself out as an expert on critical race theory or on racism or race or whatever the school board is doing in the schools. Just the way I got involved in this was I read a news article in the Loudoun County Times-Mirror about a big fracas at a school board meeting and what people were saying about critical race theory. And without even being any kind of expert, I knew immediately, well, that can't be right. I mean, you don't have to be a physicist to know that somebody tells you they're going to build an elevator to the moon to disregard their expertise. So having said that, what happened then was I wrote a column. I did some of my own reading, and that's also in the Times-Mirror, and that got a little bit of pushback, a couple letters to the editor, an article on this crazy local website, and actually an article by a professor at Patrick Henry College, which happens to be about 15 minutes away from me. I'm in Lovettsville. This is a Christian school, and this professor is just a total cut above the insanity you see on some of these websites. But instead of, his article was headlined, "This is about critical race theory," but he didn't talk about it at all. Instead, apparently he couldn't bring himself to criticize it. So he spent most of his time talking about Ibram X. Kendi, who's a writer, an African-American studies professor, I believe. I don't know where he's stationed right now. So I've talked to some law professors about this also. And I think the main thing to me about critical race theory is that it's not a catechism or a doctrine or a set of principles or rules to live by. It's a field of research. It started in law schools. I've read some of the law review articles. They're pretty dense. I mean, it's hard to imagine that being taught in high schools, much less middle school. So whatever they're doing in high school.
Can I ask about that?
Yeah.
That piece, because I do some professional work in writing learning objectives and developing coursework for both college and high school. Most of my work has been actually in artificial intelligence and some other areas like that. But the work that I did where we employed this was actually in a graduate level course. When I was an undergrad at Cornell, I got to take a grad course, and we employed different types of theory as a way to analyze different pieces of literature, feminist theory, deconstructionism. How would we even teach this at the K through 12 level? Is that even
see how you could.
possible?
I mean, you could teach about racism, and I know they're trying to do that, and I wish them good luck. It's a really daunting undertaking for a school board and a subject for schools, given the state that the country is in. If I had to reduce critical race theory to its barest essence, I would say it's about how law and institutions that appear to be race neutral or race blind can actually end up promulgating racist effects. And the interesting thing about the literature is, well, how do you get between those 2 points? It's not obvious how that would happen, but that's what the literature is about. And hopefully there's some version of that they can teach in high schools, because it's important. But now what's going on with this campaign, which is national, and you see it in state legislatures, and you see Fox News going nuts about it, including about Loudoun County on no less than Tucker Carlson's show. What they're trying to do, to my way of thinking, is this is an attempt by Trump-aligned forces after the massively discrediting events of January 6th to try to reconstitute themselves in some kind of grassroots organizing. So they're trying to do this bottom-up organizing, hyping this, what they've really raised into a boogeyman that has nothing to do with the subject. And you can see that on some of these websites, the hysteria that they're trying to foment. One thing that I was curious about was this may not be working very well, because their latest attack at the school board meeting was about dirty books. It was about something completely different. Now,
Well, that certainly is true at the local level, but nationally, though, what we're seeing, to your point, this has been all over the national news, and not just Loudoun County. There are states passing laws banning critical race theory from the schools. And I think what to me then is striking is that critical race theory is CRT. And it seems to me that people are confusing critical race theory with culturally relevant or culturally responsive teaching, which we do have in our schools. And just for definition for the viewers, culturally relevant teaching, it values and it uses characteristics, and I'll give you the quote where this comes from in the chat, experience and perspectives of ethnically diverse students to frame pedagogy and attitudes. It values students' lived experiences, learning styles, ethnic history, and accomplishments. And is community-oriented both inside and outside the classroom, is grounded in caring, values personal narrative and group efforts, encourages varying perspectives, and expects achievement. culturally relevant curriculum reflects the images and concerns of children whom it teaches, promotes critical questioning, and is committed to social justice. Finally, we do want to acknowledge that a lot of culturally relevant teaching is grounded in critical race theory. It's not, you're not teaching critical race theory. Teachers don't even necessarily have to employ critical race theory. But what we know is that children's academic achievement and engagement increases when they are taught in a culturally relevant manner. This doesn't mean what we saw in our county, which is that CRT basically says that all white people are oppressors, and that we have white students going to school being taught that their white parents are racist and they should hate their parents, which is literally what is being said here in our county as they conflate critical race theory with culturally relevant or culturally responsive teaching methods or frameworks. Do you have any thoughts on that or insights into how we understand the difference between the two, or is that even relevant at all?
I think their default move is to personalize this and to make it about the immorality of unnamed individuals. And basically they're saying there's an implicit bias here against you, whoever you may be, if you're white, to try to take it away from the substance of how you might teach about racism, and even further away from whatever critical race theory is.
One of the examples that I've read about employing this out, it actually sort of filters into the classroom, has been the controversy around things like Columbus Day, about how when we teach about the founding of America, we spend more time making sure students know the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria as examples than they actually know about the tribes of indigenous people already inhabiting these lands. And we sort of shy around these hard conversations that the reality is Columbus was a sex trafficker, he was a slave trader, and he was a rapist. That's documented in his own words. And so there seems to be this squeamishness. I'm not saying that we need to teach young children about who was and who was not a rapist, because things need to be age appropriate, but we seem to teach these things from the perspective of the colonizer rather than the people whose land is being taken. And that, will tell you, it makes people uncomfortable. Do you think that discomfort with our history and our patriotism is what's coming into play? Or, when we think about, trying to teach from different perspectives, that is one that to me seems pretty straightforward and valuable. But I know that I've seen a lot of vitriol, especially online, over things like the issue of Columbus and Thomas Jefferson, who had unfortunately, it's a similar history in terms of he owned people, he enslaved people, and that's part of our national heritage.
Well, as you say, there are people that prefer simple stories that glorify the country because they think it's a kind of civic obligation, or at least a lot of people do. And part of it is simply denial, and part of it is ignorance, and it's unfortunate. I don't see an easy way around it. Something we just have to grapple with and reject. The other side is pretty self-discrediting in terms of their hysteria and trying to make what's being taught into some alien radical ideology. Now, as an old lefty, I wouldn't mind so much some radical ideology, but I don't think that's, I'm quite sure that isn't what's going on. And in fact, critical race theory itself was, in a way, a kind of rejection of Marx and of a different legal school called critical legal studies. It was an attempt to, in a certain way, it was a distancing from what some people think is being taught in schools. But again, we're in the category there of relatively fine distinctions, whereas what we're getting from the other side is really barely modulated hysteria. So I think it's relatively easy to debunk. It's just a question of who out-organizes who. And again, I think this is what's going on underneath all this is an attempt to make the nonpartisan school board elections into a partisan election by people who are trying to sell Republican candidates, but don't want to label them as Republican because they know that the county is blue now.
So I'm gonna ask the outright hard question. In your opinion, does critical race theory actually say that all white people are racist? And
No,
then the response people say to that is, isn't that racist too? Because that's what we're seeing in the media.
No, to me, critical race theory is about institutions, and it's about the law and the racially biased effects of those. It's not about individual interpersonal relations. It's not a characterization of individual feelings. That's a separate kind of field of endeavor, but that's not what critical race theory is about. Critical race theory, to me, is social criticism. It's not about isolated individuals and the mean thoughts they harbor about people of other races. It's about how the system works. And as I wrote in my piece, it's about how the crime is what's legal in money as well as in race.
So another thing we hear is that I don't see color, I'm colorblind, and that if we bring race into schools and into analysis, it just perpetuates identity politics and racism. There was a quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which I love, which is, it's very hard for me to see how you can have a racial objective, but a non-racial means to get there when it comes to efforts of diversity, equity, quality, inclusion, and accessibility. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think, why do you think that, go ahead.
The Ginsburg quote is very much on point with respect to this. A fair amount of the critical race theory discussion is about the limits of what they call integrationism. In other words, you can have formal integration, you can have racial balance, but that's short of an assurance that African-American children are getting the education they ought to get. So in a way, it's a critique of the limits of integration and of laws that try to be objective, that ban discriminatory acts with fairly high bars as to proving what's discriminatory and what isn't, but which neglect the fact that the outcomes, even if the law on its face is race neutral, are still with us. One thing that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court has been quoted as saying is the way not to discriminate is to stop discriminating, which epitomizes the targets of critical race theory, which is indeed the fact that you can bar overt discriminatory acts, but it doesn't mean you'll get racially unbiased outcomes, because it's the way our institutions are structured and the way the laws are written to affect those outcomes. So the critical race theory discussion in some cases tries to resurrect some of the traditions in Black nationalism by pointing out, and Black power, by pointing out the importance of going beyond rules that are objective and fair on their face to the distribution of power and resources that either do or don't make for outcomes that we would all regard as fair.
So I think there's something there that you hit on that's important, and then I do want to turn it over to the rest of the ladies. Is what I think what you're essentially saying is that the intent is not important as much as the outcome, and we see that in hiring practices. The best example I always share is if you look at the top tech companies, they've tried experiments using AI in their hiring. And what they found was that because of our history of bias, we have mostly white men at the top. We have one demographic. If you bring the AI in, the AI isn't saying you're a white man, we should put this resume at the top. But what it will do is look across all those resumes and identify things like, oh, you played lacrosse, you were in this particular fraternity. And it mistakes those things as drivers of being success. And the reason I brought up the AI is because human brains have human bias, and people do that too. If you are a certain person in a certain fraternity, or you play a certain sport, our affinity groups are more likely to assume that people like us are going to be successful because we like to think of ourselves as successful. And so you can build these institutional outcomes that have an adverse impact without anybody making those decisions being overtly racist or making decisions based on race. And
Right.
which brings me back to my broader point that you brought up, that intent isn't necessarily what matters as much as outcome.
Yeah, well, my
And in
understanding is
using,
that intent actually matters in legal proceedings because
Mhm.
if you have to prove intent along with other things, that makes it that much more difficult to enforce racially fair outcomes because it's hard to read, you can't read minds. So the
and when
intent
we
is
deal with
another
adverse
legal obstacle
impact,
in this.
yeah, the legal term of adverse impact, we don't need to prove intent. You just need to prove that this is what it is. But I think where people get tripped up and take this personally, especially those of us who are white, is that the right has been successful in making this message that CRT says that if you're a white person, you are racist and you are making overtly racist decisions all the time, rather than getting to what I think is the more important point for me, is that as a white person, I can do everything in my power to be anti-racist, and I still benefit from a system that oppresses people of color in this country and raises white people up. And so, but that doesn't make me a bad person. I'm living in this world and I have obligations to try to make it better, especially in our schools. And the culturally responsive framework does go so much further beyond race. And I think people also lose sight of that. It deals with people with disabilities and other things to help kids be successful. It doesn't guarantee equity of outcome. It just makes the opportunity to excel more fair. But with that, I do want to turn it over the rest of the ladies and see what questions they have.
Hi, Max. My name is Vanessa, and welcome to the show. We have been talking about this topic for months now, and we are going through several hot button issues out here in good old Loudoun County. And to be honest, I couldn't tell you critical race theory from a hole in the wall just a few months ago. I believe and I have seen that when non-white people raise their voices and we're telling America, this is what's happening to us. It's real. We could touch it, we could feel it. And regardless of what you all think, this is prevalent. It's hard. And the whole matter in this county with the CRT is simply a diversion over the real matter that they lost the last election. They will most likely lose the next two. So what do you do when you're in a desperate situation? You reach around and try to find something to distract people from what the real matters are. CRT is one of them. But
Yeah.
I'm really glad this came up because we're all being educated right now.
Well, the funny thing is somebody mentioned, if not for Trump and these people, I mean, the field actually, I have this friend who's a professor of law, and she said the field was actually a little moribund. But in light of all this, all these antics from the other side, people are taking a new interest in it, and there's more reading and discussion of the issues than there would have been otherwise, which kind of hoists them on their own petard. But hopefully we can have the discussion will get us 2 steps forward.
Well, we have to bring these things to the forefront so we can learn, so we can discuss them. Now, I'm not going to thank anyone for bringing this to the forefront. They don't deserve a cookie. But it is a good thing that we are discussing this as educated, worldly smart, talented people, because this is where it happens. Yeah, so, oh, and let me add one other thing. Jamie mentioned something earlier that I want to reiterate, and I think I've said this on other shows. Black people cannot be racist. Let me repeat that for the people in the back. Black people cannot be racist. Racism is a man-made construct. And it was constructed by people that control the power base. We don't control any power bases in the United States. So stop calling us racist. We could be biased. We could be a little
I
prejudiced.
think that's an important point there, Vanessa, is
Right.
that bias and prejudice can exist, but racism requires institutionalized and systemic power.
Right. So
They updated the dictionary with this.
So America, stop calling us racist, and stop calling us Black supremacists too while you're at it, because there's no such thing.
Yeah, one of the criticisms of the more traditional civil rights approaches in the literature is that it sort of flattens the definition of racism in exactly the way you just criticized. We stop racism by preventing individuals, atomized individuals, from discriminating against each other, from having from failing to have good feeling about each other, and from making decisions. We have laws that prevent them from making decisions that are biased, and it ignores the entire legacy of race in the USA and the institutions that promulgate it, and along with racism. And so to say that an African American can be racist really is completely reductionist with respect to the concept properly understood, and that's a major theme in the CRT literature. And it would be nice if that was, if we could explain that to high school students somehow.
But if we were to do that with that explanation, the others have done the CRT to come to that conclusion versus actually teaching high school students to do critical race theory, which that's what this fervor is about, is our schools teaching this, which that's my first concern, is that I think this is a much more advanced type of analysis than we would do. It is not the same thing as culturally responsive teaching or culturally responsive framework. To your point, it would be great if we could teach this level of critical theory, because there are a variety of different critical theories that apply at the high school level. But K through 12 learners, this is to me, this debate just seems silly, because I don't know how you really teach this at the K through 12 level, even if you wanted to.
Well, my wife's a teacher, and it's a hard job. I don't envy anybody doing this on the front lines, or anybody in the school board trying to administer this system, but got to be done.
One of the things I wanted to kind of tap into is, I think there also is a valid conversation about understanding what racism is. I think that's at the base, at the foundation of part of the misassociation or misappropriation of who is the holder of it. I was having a conversation with someone, and I say that they're well-meaning, right? They're well-meaning and well-intentioned, but they are ignorant on the topic, and they can't understand why people then call them to racist, because they say, I don't see color, or me having a problem with people burning down the cities, and also having a problem with the January 6th insurrection, why does that make me racist? And so when you look at the term racism, there's this one hidden qualifier that is an agitator. So if we look at the conversation of oppression and, racism, the history of racism, and if you don't have a conversation with yourself to see how you value that conversation, then when you talk about the reactions or the occurrences within that conversation, that then tells you which side of the coin you're on. So for instance, if there was a person that was being held captive and was being raped repeatedly for decades, and she finally burned down the house of her captor and got free, you would call her a hero. But for some reason,
Kim, I'm sorry, Kim, you're muffled.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
If you had someone that was being held captive and being raped repeatedly by her captor for decades, and she finally burned down the house of her captor and got free, you would call her a hero. But for some reason,
And if it's Brie Larson, you give her an Academy Award.
this
Just let's be clear.
That's what I'm saying. But yet you can't understand the anger that a whole race of people carry for generations of that same issue, those same accosted. Our ancestors were raped. We were raped financially, spiritually, and mentally, continuously. So when you then come as a supporter and you say, I don't see color and I don't see a difference between the anger and on last year and the anger on the 6th, you're devaluing the experience. So you then become an agitator. So that then qualifies you by association or lack of understanding or empathy under that same category. And you are giving more power to those that are overtly racist.
One thing I've noticed is that when people on the other side of this are asked, well, how would you talk about racism? They're really at a loss. I mean, all they can really say is, well, people should treat each other, by the golden rule or something like that. But they're completely at sea when it comes to grappling with the history, the relevant history of this and how it affects the present.
And I don't have the history, I haven't delved down enough into CRT to see if it covers this conversation, but there has to be some level of information sharing. There has to be some level of education. And when we aren't readily making that available, we have to question why.
So if you were thinking about, you mentioned, what we do in the classroom, with the understanding that CRT is not being taught in the classroom, it's a more advanced thing. We do have this culturally relevant framework that isn't trying to be inclusive. And we know that actually drives student achievement. How do we know the difference? Is there a line that you think that we should be worried? Is there a legitimate line to be worried about? Because, the way you have a good lie is a kernel of truth in that. Is there, in your opinion, could this be taken too far? I will tell you that my good friend Vanessa is not a Black supremacist. That's not a thing. And that I would suggest the guy who said that take it on the chin, but we've all seen him. He doesn't have a chin, and that beard he's got going, if he's watching this, is not pulling anybody. That said, is there a legitimate kernel of truth here? Is this something where the pendulum could swing too far the other way? We know in Texas, they had textbooks that, tried to say that enslaved people were somehow happy being enslaved. So we've seen it when we go way too far one way. Is it possible it could go the other way? Is there a kernel of legitimate concern there?
Well, I think it's possible we like to see students get challenged and pushed to their limits, and it's possible to push beyond their limits, which is really up to teachers and how, I'm not in much of a position to tell people how to teach this, but and as I wrote in my piece, there's probably abuses going the other way as well from people that don't have the best way to approach this. But I think we have to stay on this road and do our best with it. I mean, it's possible to try to feed students so much that you just overwhelm them, and you're going to lose people at one end and just confuse people at the other. So it's not really for me to say how to do that. I'm not a teacher. I don't know anything about pedagogy or about these curricula that you're talking about. But I think that in terms of process, we elect a school board to make these kinds of decisions. We hope they hire or consult with people that know about this, and it's the way government works. You try to do the best you can, and with citizen input, hopefully things could be improved. The kind of input we're getting from the other side is just worthless. It's just ridiculous. It's idiotic. So that's not constructive, but there's input that from our side that I think potentially could be from people who take the time to look into how teaching is being done and how it could be improved.
Hold on, Matt.
And-
Hold on, Jamie. I just want to add a couple of words to Max's statement. I want you to add, it's unfair, it's hurtful, and it's exhausting. So just add those 3 qualifiers to your list as well.
To Kim's point about it being unfair, hurtful, and exhausting, and also I'm going to say that the fear of it is ridiculous. We now have these bills that have been passed. We have bills that have been passed in Idaho, Iowa, Oklahoma, and Tennessee, and they're being proposed in other states. I know, of course, Florida's Governor DeSantis is all over this. You know, people gave us, they're very concerned about children down there with Matt Gaetz. But my understanding from these bills is that it's so vaguely written that we don't really know, because CRT is an analytical tool, what is or is not CRT. And have we opened up a Pandora's box where we can't, if these laws are passed, even acknowledge the civil rights movement? And the other thing I want to say is that when I've heard the opposition talk about how we should deal with racism, what I hear is, well, we should teach about the civil rights movement because it makes it, that's a feel-good story, right? And they want to teach that racism is over. We know it's not over. We have examples recently of a woman whose house was appraised at, I think, $100,000 more after she removed all evidence that a Black family lived there. We have example after example of the systemic cost. That's one woman, and it is not an isolated incident. We know this happens in real estate all the time. And so again, this is a system, but given how vaguely these bills are written, is there any way to actually look at this and say, this is CRT and this is not, and this is a culturally responsive framework versus critical race theory? Because it seems like everything's getting all jumbled together. And our school district has been very clear, they're not teaching critical race theory. And I have looked at the materials, and to me, they don't seem that way as somebody who does work in diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility, of course. But how do we know? And given that, I'm going to be very frank here, Americans like things very simple. We want it to be crisp and clear. And we don't want to do the complex thought to say where this line is. Can you tell us where the line is? How do we know? Is there any way to know?
I think the impact of these bills is not in the fine print, but it's like a warning light that could have the effect. I would worry about it just having a generalized effect on school systems of people pulling in their horns, so to speak, meaning just being less aggressive and less substantive about dealing with how to teach about racism. So it could be that the law in terms of the specifics is not really enforceable, but it casts a shadow over whatever might otherwise be done in this vein. And of course, it's a political rallying point, which is its main function, and we're going to get more of it. I mean, the silliness of this is, to me, typified by something that just happened in Alabama, where they were going to ban yoga in schools because yoga was inculcating Hindu religion. And they eventually got persuaded not to do that exactly, but they now have passed a law preventing use of the word namaste. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right because I'm not a yoga person. Preventing the use of that word in schools. So, I mean, on one level, it's ridiculous and silly. On the other, it's, as was mentioned, it's hurtful and exhausting. But I think the general political tenor of the debate and how that could play out locally will have an impact.
I do have a quote from an English teacher. His name is Mike Stein, and he told Chalkbeat, Tennessee about their law there. And I quote, "History teachers cannot adequately teach about the Trail of Tears, the Civil War, and the Civil Rights Movement." And he meant as a result of this law. "English teachers will have to avoid teaching almost any text by an African-American author because many of them mentioned race to various extents." Like, this is almost a gag order on talking about race. And as someone who has studied, I mentioned my undergraduate degree is actually in literature, I can't imagine anything actually that would result in more systemic racism than eliminating African-American authors, in particular from our English classes, even at the high school level. Like, certainly colleges, I'm hoping will not do this because professors there have tenure and can do what they want, which we've seen go both ways, to your point with the interaction you had earlier. But I mean, I want to repeat that again because I think it's worth hearing. History teachers cannot adequately teach about the Trail of Tears, the Civil War, and the Civil Rights Movement. English teachers will have to avoid teaching almost any text by an African-American author because many of them mention racism to various extent.
Well, you'd have to avoid Mark Twain too.
Well, I want to interject because I haven't said anything for a reason the whole time. And we are at a space where we're trying to introduce critical race theory, something that's been around for the last 40 years or so. We're trying to shove it down the throats of people, the school board, the teachers, and everything to teach. But we are really ripping off the Band-Aid without taking care of the wound. We teachers can't even teach Black history in school. They can't give the full story of Black history. We don't even know, our kids don't even know the full extent of all of the engineers and the creators and the lab technicians and the brilliant minds that help create and cultivate this culture that we now live in. They don't have a clue because they only teach Dr. Martin Luther King, Booker T. Washington, maybe, and a few other people on Black History Month.
And Harriet Tubman.
Maybe, yeah. But then they use Black kids and have the white kids chase them around the gym. We cannot start teaching critical race theory till we properly teach Black history, because that's where the understanding is going to come from. The understanding of slavery, which they don't touch at all in school. They don't touch it. They don't talk about how they captured Africans over in Africa and brought them over on ships and threw them in the sea when they died, kept them in tight quarters. They were living in their own feces. They were probably eating them as well. They were killing them on the ships. They were raping their children and the women. They're not going to talk about all of that stuff in school. Until you're able to actually have that conversation in a classroom and cultivate a program and a lesson plan on how to teach that and at the appropriate grades to teach that, just like they teach different levels of history and it gets deeper and deeper, the higher and higher it goes. That's what they need to do with Black history. And until they teach you the wrongness that this country has done to Black Americans back then, so that they can understand what the racism actually means, this critical race theory thing is never going to happen because white people are too privileged to understand the privilege that they have. They're never going to understand, other than a few. There are some that understand. I'm not saying no one's going to understand, but the masses are not going to understand, just like Tucker Carlson, because they don't take time to learn the history. The history has to be taught. Until the history is taught, the other stuff is not going to happen. They're not going to understand it. They're not going to want to understand it. When they see what happened and they see how we were separated and they see how children were sold from their parents for pennies on the dollar, people, until they see that, until they understand that, until they feel it in their person and imagine their family being sold as a thing, until they see that, they're not going to understand theories. They're not going to understand it, and they're not going to want to do it. You can't teach that and shove that down the throat until you take care of the foundation. That's all I got to say.
Let me add something really quickly to what Mary just said. Lord, give it back to me.
Sorry.
We not only have to teach Black American history, Native American history, Hispanic American history, but we have to make it has to be integrated into the fabric of this country, because guess what? We built it for free, right? Nobody wants to talk about that either. I haven't seen that in the Virginia history curriculum.
They don't talk about how Washington was built, how it was created, how it was architected, how the White House was built. They don't talk about that.
Washington, D.C. was architected, is that a word? And planned and built by a Black man.
It is tonight.
How many folks know that? So, I mean, we could go, I mean, that's a whole nother show. I think we should do a show just on the contributions of who invented what in this country. But the last thing I want to add to what you said, Mary, was that education is the great equalizer. That's the first thing. The second thing is education starts at home. These little beautiful babies that are born, they don't pop out of their mamas being a racist. They learn that. That's learned behavior. It's taught to them. So as soon as we realize that, we can start having adult thinking conversations and just continue to learn from one another. We're all here. We're all in this together pretty much.
Yeah.
You know, it is what it is. I don't know what to say.
Yeah, I just want to kind of follow up on Mary and your point. I think it is valuable to continue that conversation, but also to bring the extension into the present, because where a lot of people get lost, not us, but a lot of people get lost, is that they are encapsulating this experience in a time period that they see as a long time ago. So there's this attitude of, well, we're not responsible for what our ancestors did then, or you're trying to play the victim because of what they experienced back when. But they don't understand how the burden and I'm about to do one of yours, Vanessa, the continuosity, what's the word? The continuity, the continuity of the systematic racism. That's where systematic racism comes into play, or oppression, because it continues in other facets as we go generation to generation. So when we talk about, you know, African Americans being historically lower income, that didn't just happen just by happenstance. We talk about things like Black Wall Street, when African Americans didn't even have the ability to own property or generate wealth for their generations to come. And when they did, what happened? It was burned to the ground. So you want to talk about last year? Let's talk about that. You know, there's all these different conversations that lead us up to today. This is not just a history lesson. This is a life lesson about who America was, who America is and who America could potentially still be if we don't do something to change the course now.
For historical perspective, just, to reiterate what Kim said, for those, because this was not taught to me in school. The last enslaved American person actually was a gentleman named Sylvester McGee, and he died October 15th, 1971. 1971. That's 2 years before I was born. So this is really much more recent. I mean, I think that when we talk about history in some of our history lessons, we try to make this out like this was ancient history. It's not. It's very recent, and it's still, go ahead, sorry.
And what came to replace slavery? The high school to prison pipeline. So let's talk about mass incarcerations. It's another form of slavery.
And that ties it easily to why we need critical race theory, to look at laws like the differential between punishment for crack and cocaine. Same drug, essentially. White people tended to do cocaine, got lesser sentences than people of color who were more likely to be arrested for using crack. And so we vilified crack. Both drugs, but one of them is we're locking people up for the rest of their lives. And now what we have going on with marijuana in this country, where we have a lot of white people making a lot of money off pot, well, we have a disproportionate number of Black men rotting in prison for something that we now have white people making money from.
Can I say one last thing? Just the other part about it being hurtful. Yes, it's hurtful to, me and my community, but I think it's hurtful to Americans, period. It's hurtful to any human being in this world that has to watch these things happen. And it is not an attack on white people. This is not a, bringing these conversations up. It's not a desire to try and say that you're evil and we're great. It's to the point of, like Vanessa said, it's the equalizer. There has to be a balance. There has to be a fair and equal balance, because every human being, no matter your color, no matter your religion, no matter your sexual orientation, you want core basic things to happen in your life: happiness, access, a good family, a good, experience. Just how you were born doesn't dictate whether or not you get to achieve that. And that's what the conversation is about, all of us coming together and acknowledging the imbalance and creating pathways to help it exist. And that's it.
Mary, you're on mute.
I didn't even realize that. Thank you so much. We are actually past our time, but I wanted to just make sure that we were all kind of clear. This is a conversation, another one of ours, as always, that needs to continue. And I want to know, Jamie, Max, Vanessa, Kimberly, do you have any, if anybody that's watching us in the comment section, if you want to if you have any questions or you want any comments that you want us to read, this is the time to do it, so we can kind of close out at 8. But any final remarks from anyone?
I think I started at the beginning to say this, that I think that if you are scared about critical race theory, you can reach out to this group. And, we got some experts, we can get some people to help, but critical race theory is not the same thing as a culturally responsive framework that they're teaching in schools. Your kids are not being taught CRT, and you shouldn't be afraid of a culturally responsive framework. This helps everybody. This is a good thing. And putting this into perspective, I mentioned I got my vote necklace on. This is like the satanic panic of the 1980s. It is meant to get everybody all lathered up over something that's not a threat and isn't actually happening. If you're too young to remember the satanic panic, you should look it up. It was the longest and most expensive legal case at that time, and nothing happened. No one was convicted. They were touting stats that said, people will be being murdered, and say they had literal statistics that more people were being murdered in satanic rituals than are actually murdered in the entire city of Austin in a year. For Austin, limited to Austin. So these were things that were simply not true. And we need to get to the truth, because the real reason this is happening is because of midterms. Historically, if you take the House and the presidency and the Senate, you lose at midterms. We are absolutely vulnerable. Laws are being passed all over the country to suppress the vote. The only way we fix this is to, one, provide education so people know that this is not something to be afraid of, and we get the vote out. We have to stay more motivated than we were with Biden's election, because otherwise we are going to lose. And all of the good progress we're making in getting coronavirus in check and rebuilding our economy, the infrastructure bill that's going to be so great, the changes that they're making within the federal workforce, which will enable our federal government to perform better for the American people, this is all at stake. And there will be no coming back.
We have one person in the chat, Ashley, and she asked if any of you have any suggestions for reading material.
I put a bunch of things into the chat, one from Ed Week that actually describes it from an educational perspective. I have Max's great article that he published in the Loudoun Times in the chat. I have to see which chat space they're in. Maggie, Mary, if you could tag me, I'll make sure they're all there, as well as an article published by a teacher who talked through her experience of understanding the difference and the similarities between critical race theory and culturally responsive teaching. I think those are good places to start. Anybody else have anything else that they researched they want to share? I put some in
there as well. As you guys were talking, I put some links in the chat as well.
I also would encourage people to find and read the Attorney General's report on the state of racism and bias in Loudoun County Public Schools. Read it.
The Attorney General.
Even if you're not from Loudoun County.
Everybody should read it. It's public knowledge.
The Attorney General's what? Say that again.
The Attorney General's report, the Virginia Attorney General's report, Mark Herring. They can Google Mark Herring AG report. And I encourage everyone to read it.
Because this is what Tucker's not going to tell you. Sorry, trust fund Tuckums, we see you.
Because the AG's report is what they're denying and was the catalyst for a lot of what you all are hearing and seeing now around CRT, because they're deniers. They're deniers, but it's all in there. So read it.
And I mean, they're really using this, as I mentioned, the Virginia Project, who does not live in Virginia. He lives in South Carolina. And I can't say for sure that he lives with his mom, but if his job title is actually stay-at-home son, I would not be surprised. That guy's what you get if you order Alex Jones off Wish, but he tweeted out my home address. I want to repeat that. He tweeted out my home address out of this issue. So they're really going to make this as much of an issue as possible. But the fact that the issue can't stand on its own, and they need to go to this level of intimidation tactics. I'm not even going to go into some of the things that have been said about my dear friend Vanessa on this, who is a complete, can I say badass on the air?
Yeah, go ahead, say it.
Vanessa's a badass. And the going after people who are trying to dispel the rumors about CRT, they wouldn't have to try to intimidate us and attack us if what we were saying wasn't true.
Correct. And Mary, if you would please put in the chat, I just tried to get to it, that folks should also Google and read the Loudoun County Public Schools Superintendent's letter stating that critical race theory is not being taught in the school system, and they can take it for whatever they want to take it for.
One other reference I do always try to refer people back to if it's helpful. If, like me, you're a Christian and you're wondering how this fits into anti-racism and your faith, you don't need to be a member of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. But I would strongly suggest, if you're looking for a Christian perspective on that, go check out the ELCA's anti-racist pledge. It goes through how this links directly to biblical doctrine, and why it's really important for those of us who are Christians to be actively anti-racist. It's not just enough to not be racist. We need to be actively anti-racist, and there's biblical support for this. So I would encourage everyone to check that out.
Okay, I am going to have to find, because I was trying to find the link to put that in the chat for you, Vanessa. I'll try and find it afterwards.
I'll try and find it too. What, the AG's report?
The AG and the letter from the county.
I think I have both on my phone. I will try to find it and upload both.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Kim, did you have any closing remarks, sweetheart?
No, I think my last statement was the place where I want to leave it. You know, this is a very personal conversation for me. I have a son that represents both sides of the conversation. And so I try to make sure that I'm giving him, you know, a thorough education so that there isn't any guilt on either side of the coin. So I think that was my last piece on it.
Good, beautifully put as always. Max, our guest for this evening, thank you so much for being here. Do you have any closing remarks for us? Anything?
Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm flattered, despite not being an expert on any of this stuff. My inclination, I mean, I don't want to tell you how to do politics, but my inclination on how to address this is, first, what was already said, it's not being taught. But secondly, if it was, that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, although it would be hard to do and it would be a challenge, but there's intrinsically nothing wrong with it. There's nothing perverse or malignant about it. And it would make for better citizens if more people understood some of that literature or had at least some passing familiarity with it.
Yeah, white people, this doesn't mean schools are teaching your kids that you're a racist. This is not what this means. Just dispel that.
Right.
It's American history is what it is.
That's all it is.
It's American history.
Their line, there was the guy, I mean, you heard of Michael Moore.
Yeah.
There was a guy that tried to sort of leech off of his fame by doing a video saying that was entitled Michael Moore Hates America. So the basic line is not to grapple with any of the substance here, or any of the issues, but to just say these people don't like you, so you shouldn't like them. And in particular, you shouldn't vote for the people that they support for school board and anything else. And again, it's a way of trying to personalize it in a particularly perverse way. And that's because I think in any kind of reasoned argument, they can be dealt with effectively, because they don't really have much in the way of arguments.
And racism is un-American and unpatriotic. Let's just state that outright. If you want to be a patriot and you love this country, and I love this country, I am so proud of the good things in this country. Dissent is the highest form of patriotism. And part of loving your country is calling it out when it's wrong and making things right. The same way you do with your kid. I'm a mother, I have 3 sons. If my kid was doing something hateful, would I be ashamed? Yes, but I'd have to step in and make it better and fix it. And we need to do this as a nation.
And can I say one last thing about this current generation? My sons are 17 and almost 19, 18 and a half, almost 19. So my oldest son is actually a millennial. And my youngest son is what they refer to as Gen Z.
Mm-hmm.
So the Gen Z babies were born with iPads and iPhones in their cribs. And let me just say something about this generation. They are phenomenal. They are the United Colors of Benetton. and they play with each other no matter what you look like, smell like, where your mama from, where your daddy from, whatever. They play, they have grown up playing with one another, and they don't subscribe to this racism BS that's going on in this country. They just don't. And we can learn so much from them. We can get our old asses in gear and listen to these kids because they're smart. We raised them, so they're smart and they're talented, okay? And they know so much more than we give them credit for. So adults, get your acts together, because most of you racists walking around here in Loudoun County, your kids don't even care what you're talking about. And I know because I talk to your kids.
Right.
So get it together.
And your oldest son is a Gen Z too, because it's 6 to 24.
6 to 24.
Ages 6 to 24.
Ah.
Yeah. And I'm going to say this to the white people: your grandbabies are going to be all different colors of beautiful shades of white and brown and black. So you should get your head in the right place for this now. This is America. What you're seeing on this screen, this is what it looks like to be American. When we think of a stereotypical American, it is not your blonde-haired, blue-eyed. Not that there's anything wrong with being blonde-haired and blue-eyed. I feel very Seinfeld with that. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But when you look at America, this is what America looks like. And that is our strength. It's what makes us innovative. It's what's going to grow our economy. This is a good thing. Sorry, Kim.
It's so funny that you said that, because I think about, my premise of there's no better equalizer than God. He will equalize it for you. And I always say, be careful about hating something, because you can vastly find that in your environment and part of your everyday, because he will teach you to love what you hate.
And we are all going to grow up.
Playing field too.
We will all grow up and apologize to our children for mistakes that we made. None of us are perfect parents. But this is not a mistake you have to make.
But we're going to fix it together. And I welcome you all back for another conversation on this at another point. Maybe we'll give it a little bit to see how far it's progressed, particularly during the summer, over the summer and things like that. But thank you, Jamie, Max, Vanessa, Kim. As always, it's a pleasure. Max, you're welcome to come back anytime. It's great to have a male on screen.
Yes, good to have you, Max.
Yes, you're our third male on screen, I believe. Am I right? Yeah, I think you're our third male on screen. So thank you for attending, and all of you who've watched and commented. Amanda, gosh, we had a bunch of Neelam, Beth, Ashley,
Courtney's there.
Courtney. We had a bunch of people jump in. They may have watched but didn't comment, but that's cool too. Thank you all for tuning in on this important conversation. Because you tuned into this conversation, lets us know that it means something. Some of you asked for materials, you want to learn, you want to read. If you watch this in replay and you need some more information or you want to reconnect, please just put it in the chat and then we'll get a notification and get back to you. But until next week, thank you so much for tuning in, and have a great weekend. Enjoy tomorrow. It's supposed to be 90 degrees.
Woohoo!
And you can share this conversation with your friends.
Yeah,
you can share this if you're.
Please feel free to share.
Oh my gosh, I feel like an Instagram kid. Please like and share.
Please like and share. No. Please like and share for real. We have a YouTube page where you can find all of our videos. We're Blue Wave Conversations, and I will put that in the comments too. But all of our videos are there, and you're welcome to watch them on replay there as well. Okay. Thank you all for watching, and have yourselves a fantastic weekend. The rest of you guys, you can hold on for a second while I get us out.